In the beginning, before the pyramids pierced the desert sky, and before the Nile carved its eternal path through golden sands, there existed forces so ancient and powerful that they shaped the very fabric of reality itself. Tonight, as you settle into the embrace of sleep, let me take you on a journey through the mystical realm of ancient Egypt, where gods walked among mortals and magic flowed as freely as the sacred river that gave life to an entire civilization. Close your eyes and imagine the gentle lapping of papyrus boats against wooden docks, the soft whisper of wind through temple columns, and the distant chanting of priests as they perform their sacred rituals under star-filled skies. This is where our story begins, in a world where the boundary between the divine and mortal was as thin as morning mist over the delta. Our tale centers on Isis, whose name means throne, a goddess whose influence would span millennia and whose story encompasses love, betrayal, death, and resurrection. She stands as one of the most powerful and beloved deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon, a figure whose worship would eventually spread far beyond the borders of Egypt to encompass the entire ancient world. But to truly understand the magnitude of her story, we must first understand the cosmic stage upon which it unfolds. Picture, if you will, the primordial waters of Nun, an endless ocean of potential that existed before creation itself. From these chaotic waters emerged the first consciousness, a divine spark that would begin the process of bringing order to the universe. This was the birth of the gods, beings of such immense power that their very thoughts could reshape reality and whose emotions could flood the world or bring devastating drought. The creation of the world began with Atum, the self-created god who emerged from the primordial waters through sheer force of will. Standing alone in the vast emptiness, Atum possessed both male and female qualities within himself, for there was no other being in existence with whom to create life. Through an act of divine self-generation, he brought forth the first pair of deities, Shu and Tefnut, who represented air and moisture respectively. These twin deities embraced in the darkness of pre-creation, and from their union came Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. The relationship between these primordial forces was passionate yet troubled, for Geb and Nut loved each other so intensely that they remained locked in eternal embrace, leaving no space between earth and sky for life to flourish. Their bodies pressed together so tightly that nothing could exist in the compressed space between them. Ra, the sun god who had emerged as the supreme deity, recognized that this cosmic embrace threatened the very possibility of creation. He commanded Shu to separate the lovers, and with tremendous effort, the air god lifted Nut high above Geb, creating the space between heaven and earth where all life would eventually flourish. Nut's star-spangled body formed the dome of the sky, while Geb's green flesh became the fertile earth below. But the separation came with consequences that would echo throughout eternity. Ra, perhaps fearing the power that might come from the union of earth and sky, pronounced a curse upon Nut. He declared that she would never give birth on any day of the year, effectively preventing her from having children. This seemed to condemn the sky goddess to eternal barrenness, but the gods of Egypt were nothing if not resourceful. Thoth, the wise god of wisdom and writing, took pity on Nut's plight. In a cosmic game of Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game, he challenged Khonsu, the moon god, to a contest of skill and cunning. The stakes were high, for Thoth wagered that if he won, Khonsu would give him portions of his own light. Khonsu, confident in his gaming abilities, accepted the challenge. The game lasted for hours, with divine strategies unfolding across the board like military campaigns. Thoth's wisdom proved superior, and he won not just one round, but several, claiming enough of Khonsu's moonlight to create 5 additional days. These days existed outside the normal calendar, beyond the reach of Ra's curse, and it was during these precious stolen days that Nut could finally give birth. On the first of these extra days, Osiris was born, emerging into the world as a god destined for kingship and order. The very moment of his birth was marked by cosmic signs, as a voice rang out across the heavens, proclaiming that the Lord of all creation had been born. Temples trembled with divine energy, and mortals throughout Egypt felt an inexplicable sense of hope and renewal. The second day brought forth Horus the Elder, a sky god whose eyes were said to be the sun and moon, and whose wings could span the entire width of the heavens. His birth was accompanied by the cry of a falcon that echoed across the cosmos, a sound that would become sacred to the Egyptian people for thousands of years to come. On the third day, Set was born, but his arrival was violent and premature. Rather than waiting for natural birth, he tore his way out of Nut's side, causing her tremendous pain and leaving cosmic scars across the sky. From the moment of his traumatic birth, Set was associated with chaos, violence, and the harsh desert winds that could destroy crops and bury entire cities in sand. The fourth day saw the birth of Isis, and her arrival was marked by such beauty and grace that even the other gods paused in their cosmic duties to witness her emergence into existence. She was born with knowledge of magic already flowing through her divine essence, understanding secrets of the universe that even some of the older gods had yet to discover. Her first cry was said to have the power to heal wounds and calm troubled hearts. Finally, on the 5th day, Nephthys was born, destined to be both sister and shadow to Isis, a goddess of mourning and protection who would stand at the boundaries between life and death. Her birth completed the divine family that would shape the destiny of Egypt and influence the fate of both gods and mortals for millennia to come. As these 5 siblings grew to maturity in the realm of the gods, their individual natures began to manifest more clearly. Osiris developed into a wise and benevolent ruler, learning the arts of civilization and governance that he would one day teach to humanity. He mastered agriculture, lawmaking, and the construction of cities, becoming the embodiment of order and prosperity. Isis grew into a goddess of unparalleled magical ability, studying the hidden names of power and learning to manipulate the very forces that held the universe together. She could heal any wound, raise the dead, and command the elements themselves to obey her will. Her beauty was matched only by her intelligence, and her compassion encompassed all living things. Set, by contrast, became increasingly associated with the wild and destructive forces of nature. He ruled over the desert regions, where scorching winds could kill travelers, and where dangerous creatures lurked in the shadows of rocky outcroppings. His strength was legendary, but his temper was equally formidable, and he often acted without considering the consequences of his actions. Horus the Elder claimed dominion over the sky, soaring through the heavens on powerful wings and watching over the world below with eyes that could see across vast distances. His perspective from above gave him wisdom about the patterns of mortal life, but also sometimes made him seem distant and aloof from earthly concerns. Nephthys, the youngest, found her calling in the liminal spaces between life and death, learning to guide souls through their transitions and to comfort those who mourned. She possessed a gentle strength that could provide solace in the darkest moments, though her association with endings sometimes made others wary of her presence. The relationships between these divine siblings would prove to be as complex as their individual natures. Osiris and Isis were drawn to each other from their earliest days, recognizing in one another complementary qualities that made them stronger together than apart. Their love was deep and pure, based on mutual respect and shared vision for bringing order and prosperity to the world. Set, however, harbored growing resentment toward his older brother, Osiris, whose natural leadership abilities and moral character made him the obvious choice to inherit their grandfather Ra's authority over the earth. This jealousy festered in Set's heart like a wound that would not heal, poisoning his thoughts and gradually transforming his competitive nature into something darker and more dangerous. The stage was thus set for a cosmic drama that would unfold across centuries, involving not just the gods themselves, but eventually drawing in all of Egypt and its people. The love between Isis and Osiris would be tested by betrayal and death, while their struggle against Set's chaotic ambitions would require them to discover reserves of power and determination they never knew they possessed. As the divine siblings prepared to take their places in the cosmic order, the mortal world below remained largely unaware of the forces gathering above them. Egyptian civilization was still in its infancy, with humans living in small settlements along the Nile, practicing basic agriculture and worshiping local deities whose influence rarely extended beyond individual villages. But change was coming, carried on desert winds and whispered in the rustling of papyrus reeds. The gods were about to descend from their celestial realm to walk among mortals, bringing with them gifts of knowledge and civilization, but also the seeds of conflicts that would reshape the very foundations of Egyptian society. The golden age that was about to dawn would see the establishment of the first great dynasties, the construction of monuments that would endure for thousands of years, and the development of religious and magical practices that would influence cultures far beyond Egypt's borders. Yet it would also witness betrayal, murder, and a war between order and chaos that would test the limits of divine power and mortal endurance. In the celestial realm where the gods dwelt, time moved differently than it did in the mortal world below. What seemed like years to humans passed as mere moments to the divine beings who shaped reality with their thoughts and emotions. During this period of cosmic preparation, each of the 5 siblings began to understand their unique roles in the grand tapestry of existence that was slowly being woven around them. Isis spent her time in deep study, exploring the hidden chambers of divine knowledge that existed in the spaces between thoughts and dreams. She learned to read the sacred hieroglyphs that appeared in the air when powerful magic was worked, symbols that contained the fundamental building blocks of creation itself. Her fingers traced patterns in the cosmic dust, creating spells that could mend broken hearts, restore withered crops, and breathe life into clay figures molded from Nile mud. The goddess discovered that magic was not simply about commanding forces to obey her will, but about understanding the intricate connections that bound all things together. Every star in the night sky was connected to every grain of sand in the desert. Every drop of water in the great river was linked to every tear shed by a mourning mother. This web of connection became her greatest source of power, for she learned to pluck the strands of reality like a cosmic harp, creating harmonies that could reshape the world according to her vision. Meanwhile, Osiris dedicated himself to mastering the arts of leadership and civilization. He studied the patterns of growth that governed plants and animals, learning how societies could flourish when guided by wisdom and justice. In his divine workshops, he experimented with creating tools that would make human life easier, developing the first plows that could break tough ground, the first looms that could weave fine cloth, and the first brewing techniques that could transform grain into nourishing beer. His vision extended far beyond mere technological advancement. Osiris dreamed of a world where humans could live together in harmony, where disputes could be resolved through fair laws rather than violence, and where the strong would protect the weak rather than exploit them. He spent countless hours crafting the perfect legal codes, systems of governance that would ensure prosperity and justice for all who lived under his rule. Set, however, found himself increasingly isolated from his siblings' noble pursuits. While they focused on creation and healing, he was drawn to the raw, untamed forces that existed at the edges of the ordered world. He roamed the vast deserts that stretched beyond the fertile Nile Valley, befriending the fierce creatures that thrived in those harsh landscapes. Scorpions, serpents, and jackals became his companions, and he learned to speak their ancient languages of survival and predation. The desert taught Set lessons that his siblings never learned in their studies of civilization. He discovered that sometimes destruction was necessary for renewal, that forest fires could clear away diseased growth and allow healthy plants to flourish. He learned that predators played essential roles in maintaining the balance of nature, preventing any single species from overwhelming the ecosystem. These harsh truths shaped his understanding of his own role in the cosmic order, though his interpretation of these lessons would eventually lead him down a dark path. Horus the Elder soared through the highest reaches of the sky, his keen eyes observing the patterns of wind and weather that would determine the fate of crops and the success of river voyages. From his lofty perspective, he could see how individual actions rippled outward to affect entire communities, how a single decision made by a village elder might ultimately influence the destiny of an entire kingdom. This knowledge made him wise, but also somewhat detached from the immediate concerns of earthly life. Nephthys walked the shadowy boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, learning to comfort souls as they made their final journey into the afterlife. She discovered that death was not an ending, but a transformation, a sacred passage that required careful guidance and protection. Her gentle presence became a source of comfort to those facing their final moments, while her knowledge of the afterlife's mysteries would prove invaluable in the trials that lay ahead. As the siblings developed their individual powers and perspectives, the mortal world below continued its own evolution. Small farming communities along the Nile began to grow into larger settlements, and ambitious leaders started to unite neighboring villages under their rule. Trade networks developed as people discovered that some regions produced superior pottery, while others excelled at metalworking or livestock breeding. The humans of this early period lived in constant awareness of the divine forces that shaped their world. They saw the gods in every sunrise and sunset, felt their presence in the flooding of the Nile and the growing of their crops. Simple shrines appeared in villages throughout Egypt, often nothing more than a pile of stones or a wooden post decorated with offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. It was during this period of gradual human development that Ra, the supreme sun god, began to contemplate retirement from his active role in governing the world. The daily journey across the sky, bringing light and warmth to all of creation, had begun to weary him after eons of faithful service. He looked upon the young gods with approval, recognizing that they possessed the wisdom and power necessary to take over his earthly responsibilities. Ra's decision to step back from direct governance would set in motion the events that would define the rest of our story. He announced to the divine assembly that Osiris, as the eldest and wisest of the new generation, would inherit the throne of Egypt and become the first divine pharaoh to rule over both gods and mortals. This pronouncement was met with joy by most of the celestial court, but it ignited a flame of jealousy in Set's heart that would eventually consume everything in its path. The transition of power was planned as a grand celebration that would span several years, allowing Osiris time to establish his authority gradually while Ra remained available for counsel and guidance. During this transitional period, Isis and Osiris would descend to the mortal world to begin their reign, bringing with them the gifts of civilization that would transform Egypt from a collection of scattered tribes into a unified kingdom. The preparations for this momentous change involved the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods. Thoth prepared scrolls containing the laws and wisdom that would guide the new kingdom, while Ptah designed the first great temples where mortals could properly worship their divine rulers. Hathor composed songs and dances that would celebrate the coronation, and Sobek agreed to guard the sacred waters of the Nile during the vulnerable transition period. Even the minor deities contributed to the preparations. The gods of individual cities and regions gathered their local knowledge and traditions, ready to integrate them into the larger framework of unified Egyptian civilization. River spirits prepared to guide the boats that would carry news of the new kingdom throughout the land, while desert spirits agreed to protect the trade routes that would connect distant communities. As these divine preparations continued, Isis and Osiris spent their final days in the celestial realm, deepening their understanding of each other and their shared mission. They would walk together through the cosmic gardens where the gods cultivated ideas and dreams, discussing their vision for the perfect society and refining their plans for bringing prosperity to the mortal world. Their conversations ranged across every aspect of human existence. They spoke of how to design cities that would be both beautiful and practical, with wide avenues for ceremonial processions, but also efficient systems for bringing fresh water to every household. They planned agricultural policies that would ensure abundant harvests while maintaining the health of the soil for future generations. Isis shared her magical knowledge with Osiris, teaching him healing spells that would allow him to cure diseases and mend injuries among his mortal subjects. She showed him how to consecrate sacred spaces where the boundary between the divine and mortal worlds was thin, places where prayers could be heard more clearly and where divine blessings could flow more freely into the human realm. Osiris, in turn, taught Isis the subtle arts of leadership and diplomacy. He showed her how to read the unspoken thoughts behind people's words, how to identify the true concerns that drove apparently unreasonable demands, and how to craft solutions that would satisfy competing interests while serving the greater good. Their love deepened through these shared preparations, becoming something far more profound than romantic attraction. They became true partners in the divine work of creation, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for the other's limitations. Their union represented the perfect balance between wisdom and compassion, between justice and mercy, between the visionary ideals of divine perfection and the practical needs of mortal existence. Set observed these preparations with growing bitterness, feeling increasingly excluded from his siblings' grand plans. While they focused on building and creating, he found himself drawn to thoughts of destruction and conquest. He began to question whether Osiris truly deserved the throne, whether someone so focused on peace and prosperity could effectively deal with the harsh realities of governing a world that contained both light and darkness. These doubts were encouraged by whispers from the chaotic forces that existed at the edges of creation, entities that had been displaced when order was first imposed upon the primordial waters. They spoke to Set in his dreams, suggesting that he possessed strengths that his siblings lacked, that his understanding of conflict and struggle made him better suited to rule in a world where survival often required difficult choices. The stage was thus set for the great drama that would unfold when the gods finally descended to walk among mortals. The love between Isis and Osiris would be tested by forces they could barely comprehend, while their vision of a perfect civilization would face challenges that no amount of divine wisdom could fully prepare them to meet. The moment finally arrived when the celestial court gathered for the formal ceremony that would mark the beginning of Osiris's reign over Egypt. The great hall of Ra resonated with divine music as beings of pure light and energy assembled to witness this historic transition of power. Golden thrones materialized from crystallized sunbeams, while tables laden with ambrosia and nectar appeared throughout the vast space, their surfaces gleaming with otherworldly radiance. Ra himself presided over the ceremony, his form shifting between the blazing solar disk and the majestic figure of a man crowned with the sun's fire. As he spoke, the ancient words that would transfer his earthly authority to Osiris, the very fabric of reality seemed to shimmer and reorganize itself around the new divine order. Each syllable carried the weight of cosmic law, binding the younger god to responsibilities that would shape the destiny of countless generations. Isis stood beside her beloved as he accepted the crook and flail, the traditional symbols of pharaonic authority that had been forged in the heart of stars and tempered in the tears of creation itself. The golden serpent of divine wisdom coiled around Osiris's brow, its eyes glowing with the accumulated knowledge of all the ages that had come before. When the ceremonial crown settled upon his head, every god present felt the shift in cosmic balance as power flowed from the old ruler to the new. The celebration that followed lasted for what mortals would measure as months, though time held little meaning in the realm where gods dwelt. Divine musicians played instruments that created melodies from the movements of planets and the whispered songs of distant stars. Dancers moved in patterns that traced the paths of comets across the sky, their graceful forms leaving trails of stardust that formed new constellations in honor of the occasion. Throughout these festivities, Set maintained a facade of brotherly support, raising his cup in toasts to Osiris's success and speaking words of encouragement that rang hollow to those who knew him well. Yet beneath his forced smile, the seeds of resentment continued to grow, nourished by each moment of praise directed toward his brother and each expression of confidence in Osiris's ability to rule wisely and well. When the celestial celebrations finally drew to a close, Isis and Osiris began their preparations for the momentous journey to the mortal realm. This transition required careful planning, for divine beings could not simply appear among humans without causing disruption to the delicate balance that maintained the boundary between heaven and earth. They would need to manifest in forms that mortals could comprehend without being overwhelmed by their true divine nature. The process of incarnation involved gradually condensing their cosmic essence into physical bodies that could interact with the material world while retaining enough of their divine nature to perform the miraculous works that would establish their authority among mortals. Isis chose to appear as a woman of extraordinary beauty, her dark hair flowing like the night sky filled with stars, her eyes holding depths that reflected the wisdom of eternity itself. Osiris took the form of a tall, noble man whose presence radiated strength and benevolence. His skin bore the healthy bronze of someone who had worked under the sun, yet his bearing spoke of royal authority, tempered by genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority of a father guiding his children, firm enough to command respect, yet warm enough to inspire love and loyalty. Their first manifestation occurred at dawn on the banks of the Nile, near a small farming community that had recently begun to experiment with more sophisticated agricultural techniques. The rising sun seemed to pause in its journey across the sky as two figures materialized from the golden light, walking across the water's surface as easily as others might stroll through a garden. The local villagers, who witnessed this miraculous appearance, fell to their knees in awe, recognizing immediately that they were in the presence of divine beings. Yet rather than inspiring terror, Isis and Osiris radiated such warmth and compassion that the humans felt drawn to them like children to loving parents. The gods' first words were not commands or demands for worship, but gentle inquiries about the villagers' needs and concerns. Word of their arrival spread quickly along the river, carried by merchants and fishermen who had witnessed the miraculous events. Within days, representatives from communities throughout the Nile Valley began making pilgrimages to meet these divine rulers who had chosen to dwell among mortals rather than remaining in their celestial palace. Osiris wasted no time in beginning his work of civilization. He observed how the farmers struggled with primitive tools and taught them to forge stronger plows from bronze and iron. He showed them how to harness the power of oxen more effectively, how to construct irrigation channels that would bring water to previously barren fields, and how to store grain in ways that would protect it from rodents and decay. But his gifts extended far beyond agricultural innovation. Osiris established the first comprehensive legal system that Egypt had ever known, creating courts where disputes could be resolved through reasoned discussion rather than violence. He taught the principles of justice that recognized both the rights of individuals and the needs of the community, showing how personal freedom and social responsibility could exist in harmony. The God King's approach to law emphasized restoration rather than punishment, seeking solutions that would heal communities torn apart by conflict rather than simply deterring future wrongdoing. Thieves were required to make restitution to their victims and to perform community service that would demonstrate their commitment to becoming productive members of society. Those who had committed acts of violence were guided through processes of reconciliation that addressed the root causes of their anger while ensuring the safety of potential victims. Isis complemented her husband's work by establishing schools where both children and adults could learn the arts of reading and writing. She created the first libraries, great halls filled with papyrus scrolls that preserved not only practical knowledge about farming, medicine, and crafts, but also stories, songs, and philosophical teachings that enriched the human spirit. Her magical abilities proved invaluable in healing the sick and injured who came seeking divine intervention. Yet rather than simply performing miraculous cures, Isis took time to teach mortal healers the principles behind her methods. She showed them which herbs could reduce fever, how to set broken bones properly, and how to create the sterile conditions necessary for successful surgery. The goddess also revolutionized the role of women in Egyptian society, establishing their right to own property, conduct business, and participate in religious ceremonies as equals to men. She trained priestesses in the sacred arts, creating a network of wise women who could serve their communities as healers, counselors, and spiritual guides. Under the benevolent rule of Isis and Osiris, Egyptian civilization flourished in ways that exceeded even the gods' most optimistic expectations. Villages grew into towns, towns expanded into cities, and cities began to specialize in particular crafts and industries that created wealth through trade with distant regions. The Nile became a highway of commerce as boats carried goods, ideas, and cultural innovations from the Mediterranean coast to the southern cataracts. Artists and craftsmen, inspired by divine patronage, created works of unprecedented beauty and sophistication. Sculptors learned to carve stone with such skill that their statues seemed to breathe with life, while painters developed techniques for creating images that captured not just physical appearance, but the essential character of their subjects. Musicians composed symphonies that incorporated the natural rhythms of wind, water, and growing things, creating harmonies that could heal emotional wounds and inspire acts of courage and compassion. The architectural achievements of this golden age established patterns that would influence Egyptian building for thousands of years. Temples rose from the desert sands like man-made mountains, their massive columns and soaring chambers designed to inspire awe while providing practical spaces for religious ceremonies and community gatherings. Palace complexes demonstrated how grandeur and comfort could be combined with efficient organization and beautiful decoration. Yet perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Osiris's reign was the development of a unified Egyptian identity that transcended the tribal and regional loyalties that had previously divided the land. People began to think of themselves not just as members of particular villages or clans, but as citizens of a great civilization that stretched from the Delta to the First Cataract. This shared identity was reinforced through common laws, shared festivals, and the worship of gods who were revered throughout the kingdom. The annual flooding of the Nile became a celebration that united all Egyptians in gratitude for the divine gift that made their prosperity possible. Osiris established rituals that honored not just the river itself, but the cosmic forces that governed its cycles and the human efforts required to make the most of its bounty. These ceremonies strengthened the bonds between communities while reinforcing their connection to the divine powers that watched over them. As years passed and the benefits of divine rule became increasingly apparent, neighboring regions began sending delegations to Egypt, seeking to learn the secrets of this remarkable civilization. Some came as students, hoping to acquire knowledge they could take back to improve their own societies. Others arrived as traders, drawn by reports of Egyptian wealth and craftsmanship. A few came as potential enemies, scouting the defenses of a kingdom that had grown rich and might therefore be vulnerable to conquest. Osiris received all these visitors with the same gracious hospitality, sharing Egypt's innovations freely while making it clear that the kingdom's prosperity was protected by divine power as well as human wisdom. He established diplomatic protocols that encouraged peaceful exchange while deterring aggression, creating alliances based on mutual benefit rather than domination or submission. The god king's reputation for wisdom and justice spread far beyond Egypt's borders, inspiring other rulers to seek his counsel on matters of governance and law. His responses to their questions often took the form of parables and allegories that conveyed profound truths while respecting the dignity and intelligence of those who sought his guidance. During this period of unprecedented prosperity and peace, Isis and Osiris also found time to deepen their personal relationship and explore the joys of married life among mortals. They established a palace that served simultaneously as a center of government and a home where they could experience the simple pleasures of companionship and shared purpose. Their love story became the stuff of legend throughout Egypt, inspiring countless songs and stories that celebrated the perfect union of wisdom and compassion, strength and gentleness, justice and mercy. Young couples sought their blessing on wedding days, while those facing marital difficulties looked to their example for guidance on how to resolve conflicts through understanding and compromise. Yet even as Egypt basked in this golden age of peace and prosperity, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon of the future. Set's resentment had not diminished with time, but had instead fermented into a bitter hatred that poisoned every aspect of his existence. The success of his brother's reign only intensified his conviction that he had been unjustly denied his rightful place as ruler of the gods and mortals alike. The desert winds carried whispers of Set's growing malice across the vast expanse of golden sand, and those who lived at the edges of civilization began to notice subtle changes in the natural order. Oasis springs that had flowed clear for generations suddenly turned bitter and alkaline. Sandstorms arose without warning, burying trade routes that had been stable for decades. The creatures of the wasteland grew more aggressive and territorial, as if responding to some invisible call that urged them toward violence and chaos. Set had begun to gather allies from among the beings that thrived in harsh, unforgiving places. The ancient spirits of drought and famine, who had been dormant during Egypt's time of plenty, stirred to wakefulness at his summons. Demons of pestilence and discord, creatures that fed on suffering and despair, crept from their hiding places in forgotten tombs and abandoned ruins to answer his call for vengeance. In the shadowy realm that existed between the ordered world of civilization and the primordial chaos from which all things emerged, Set established a court of his own. Here, surrounded by beings whose very existence threatened the stability that Osiris had worked so hard to create, the god of storms and desert fury began to plan his brother's downfall. His palace was carved from black obsidian that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, its chambers filled with the echoing sounds of grinding stone and howling wind. The conspirators who gathered in Set's dark court were united by their resentment of the ordered world that had displaced them. Ancient serpents who had once terrorized early humans before being banished to the deepest caves spoke of their desire to reclaim the surface world. Spirits of disease who had been weakened by Isis's healing magic plotted ways to spread their influence despite her protective spells. Even some of the younger gods, those who felt overshadowed by Osiris's reputation and excluded from the inner circle of divine authority, found themselves drawn to Set's promises of change and revolution. Yet for all his growing power and expanding network of allies, Set understood that he could not simply challenge his brother through direct confrontation. Osiris commanded the loyalty of too many gods and mortals. His reputation for wisdom and justice had made him nearly invulnerable to open attack. Any assault that appeared obviously motivated by jealousy or ambition would likely rally even neutral deities to Osiris's defense, potentially strengthening his position rather than weakening it. Instead, Set began to devise a plan of such cunning and complexity that it would take advantage of his brother's greatest strengths and transform them into fatal weaknesses. He would use Osiris's trusting nature against him, exploiting the very compassion and family loyalty that made him such a beloved ruler. The trap he envisioned would be so subtle, so perfectly crafted to appear as something other than what it truly was, that even Osiris's divine wisdom might not recognize the danger until it was far too late. The first phase of Set's plan involved gradually undermining confidence in Osiris's rule through carefully orchestrated incidents that could be attributed to natural causes or human failure rather than divine intervention. Crop failures began to occur in regions that had previously been models of agricultural success, but these disasters struck during seasons when weather patterns made such setbacks appear plausible. Trade expeditions encountered unusually severe storms or bandit attacks, but always in areas known to be dangerous during certain times of year. Those seemingly random misfortunes created whispers of doubt among some Egyptians who began to wonder whether their divine rulers had somehow lost favor with the cosmic forces that governed prosperity and success. Set's agents, disguised as concerned citizens and loyal subjects, carefully amplified these concerns by asking seemingly innocent questions about whether Osiris might be growing complacent in his divine duties or whether some unknown transgression had angered the supreme gods. Meanwhile, Set himself began to appear more frequently at court functions and royal ceremonies, playing the role of the devoted brother who stood ready to support Osiris during these challenging times. He offered assistance with investigations into the recent problems, volunteered to lead expeditions to troubled regions, and spoke eloquently about the need for all members of the royal family to stand together against whatever forces might be threatening Egypt's prosperity. His performances were masterful examples of deception, combining just enough genuine concern to appear sincere with subtle suggestions that perhaps Osiris was bearing too heavy a burden and might benefit from sharing more responsibilities with his capable younger brother. Set presented himself as the practical, experienced leader who understood the harsh realities of governing in a world where not all problems could be solved through wisdom and compassion alone. Isis, with her deep understanding of magic and her intuitive grasp of hidden motivations, began to sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the recent pattern of misfortunes. The timing of the disasters seemed too convenient, their distribution too carefully calculated to create maximum disruption with minimum obvious cause. Her attempts to investigate these incidents through magical means, however, were consistently frustrated by layers of concealment spells that suggested divine involvement in the growing crisis. When she shared her suspicions with Osiris, he listened carefully, but found himself reluctant to believe that any member of his family could be involved in deliberate sabotage. His faith in the fundamental goodness of his siblings, particularly Set, made it difficult for him to accept that jealousy could have transformed his brother into an enemy. The very qualities that made Osiris such an effective and beloved ruler, his willingness to trust and his belief in the possibility of redemption, created blind spots that Set was expertly exploiting. The goddess found herself in the frustrating position of knowing that danger was approaching while being unable to identify its exact nature or source. Her magical investigations revealed patterns of hostile intention swirling around the royal court like invisible storm clouds, but the specific details remained maddeningly elusive. Every divination spell she cast returned cryptic warnings about betrayal from within the family, yet the evidence she could present to Osiris remained circumstantial and open to alternative interpretation. As Set's campaign of subtle undermining continued, he began to introduce more direct elements into his strategy. He started hosting private gatherings for gods and prominent mortals who had expressed concerns about the recent troubles, presenting these meetings as informal discussions about how to best support Osiris during difficult times. In reality, these gatherings served as recruitment sessions where Set could identify potential allies and gradually introduce them to increasingly radical ideas about the need for change and divine leadership. The god of chaos proved remarkably skilled at reading his audience and tailoring his message to their specific concerns and motivations. To gods who felt undervalued in the current system, he spoke about the need for broader representation in divine governance. To mortals who had suffered losses during the recent disasters, he offered sympathy and subtle suggestions that perhaps a ruler with more direct experience of hardship might be better equipped to protect them from future calamities. Throughout these conversations, Set was careful never to directly criticize Osiris or openly advocate for revolution. Instead, he positioned himself as a loyal brother who was simply concerned about the growing challenges facing the kingdom and wanted to ensure that all available resources were being utilized effectively. His approach was so subtle and seemingly reasonable that many of those who attended his gatherings left feeling that they had participated in constructive discussions about governance rather than conspiracy meetings. The network of supporters that Set gradually assembled through these methods was diverse and strategically valuable. It included gods who controlled important aspects of natural phenomena, wealthy merchants whose businesses had been affected by recent trade disruptions, military commanders who worried about Egypt's ability to defend itself against external threats, and religious leaders who had begun to question whether the current divine order was truly serving the needs of their communities. Each member of this growing conspiracy was told only what they needed to know about Set's ultimate objectives, and many were led to believe that they were simply participating in efforts to strengthen and reform the current system rather than replace it entirely. This compartmentalized approach protected Set from exposure while ensuring that his supporters would be genuinely surprised and confused if accusations of treachery were ever raised against him. As the web of conspiracy grew more complex and extensive, Set began to plan the centerpiece of his campaign against Osiris. This would need to be an event so dramatic and apparently spontaneous that it would catch his brother completely off guard while providing plausible justification for the radical changes that would follow. The trap he envisioned would exploit Osiris's love of celebration and his trust in family bonds, turning a moment of joy into the catalyst for tragedy. The opportunity Set had been waiting for presented itself when the annual festival of the inundation approached, the great celebration that marked the life-giving flood of the Nile and renewed Egypt's covenant with the divine forces that sustained their civilization. This festival traditionally brought together gods and mortals from throughout the kingdom for weeks of ceremony, feasting, and entertainment that strengthened the bonds of community and reinforced the legitimacy of divine rule. Set volunteered to take charge of organizing the festival's entertainment, claiming that he wanted to surprise his brother with particularly elaborate celebrations that would demonstrate the kingdom's prosperity and the loyalty of its people. Osiris, pleased by this apparent gesture of brotherly devotion and eager to encourage Set's involvement in constructive activities, readily agreed to let him handle these arrangements. Working with craftsmen and artists who were unknowingly contributing to his treacherous scheme, Set commissioned the creation of an ornate chest or sarcophagus that would serve as the centerpiece of his trap. This container was designed to appear as a magnificent gift worthy of a divine king, decorated with intricate carvings that told the story of Osiris's achievements and inlaid with precious metals and gems that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. The chest's dimensions were calculated with mathematical precision to match Osiris's exact physical measurements, though this crucial detail was disguised through artistic elements that made the sizing appear purely aesthetic rather than functional. Set claimed that the container was intended as a symbolic representation of the cosmic order that Osiris had established, a artistic masterpiece that would be displayed in the royal palace as a permanent reminder of divine authority and benevolent rule. The festival began with traditional ceremonies that honored the rising waters of the Nile and the agricultural abundance they brought to Egypt's fertile fields. Priests performed ancient rituals that had been refined and elevated under Osiris's guidance, while musicians played compositions that celebrated both the natural cycles of the river and the human achievements that had transformed Egypt into a beacon of civilization. Isis participated in these opening ceremonies with her usual grace and dignity, yet those who knew her well could detect an underlying tension in her manner that suggested her intuitive warnings about approaching danger had grown stronger. She found herself studying the faces in the crowds more carefully than usual, searching for signs of hostile intention or hidden agenda among the thousands of celebrants who had gathered for the festival. The goddess's magical senses were almost overwhelmed by the complex mixture of emotions and intentions that swirled through the festival grounds. Joy and gratitude predominated, as was appropriate for such a celebration, but she detected undercurrents of anxiety, resentment, and anticipation that seemed out of place in what should have been a purely festive atmosphere. Her attempts to trace these disturbing emanations to their sources, however, were frustrated by the sheer number of people present and the deliberately chaotic nature of Set's concealment spells. As the festival progressed through its traditional sequence of public ceremonies and private gatherings, Set began to implement the final stages of his carefully orchestrated plan. He arranged for the magnificent chest to be presented during a banquet that would bring together the most important gods and mortals in attendance, timing the revelation for a moment when wine and celebration had lowered everyone's guard while ensuring that maximum witnesses would be present for what was about to unfold. The banquet hall was decorated with unprecedented luxury. Its walls was hung with tapestries that depicted the greatest achievements of Osiris's reign, while tables groaned under the weight of delicacies gathered from throughout the known world. The atmosphere was one of relaxed festivity as the assembled guests enjoyed food, drink, and entertainment that celebrated the prosperity and peace that divine rule had brought to Egypt. Set waited until the evening reached its peak of conviviality before calling for attention and announcing that he had prepared a special surprise to honor his beloved brother. The ornate chest was brought forward on the shoulders of specially selected bearers, its beauty and craftsmanship drawing gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. Set explained that this masterpiece represented the eternal nature of Osiris's achievements and invited everyone to examine its intricate details and artistic excellence. The presentation was handled with such apparent sincerity and family devotion that even Isis found herself momentarily reassured about her husband's safety. The chest was undeniably magnificent, worthy of housing the most precious treasures in Egypt, and Set's explanation of its symbolic significance seemed entirely appropriate for such an occasion. The goddess began to wonder whether her earlier apprehensions had been the result of general anxiety rather than specific supernatural warnings. As the guests admired the chest and praised Set for his thoughtfulness and artistic vision, the god of chaos suggested that they should determine who among them was worthy to possess such a magnificent creation. He proposed a seemingly innocent game where each person would lie down inside the chest to see how well they fit, with the understanding that whoever matched its dimensions most perfectly would be declared its rightful owner. This suggestion was met with laughter and enthusiasm from guests who had been made mellow by wine and celebration. The game seemed like harmless entertainment, a playful way to involve everyone in appreciating Set's gift while adding an element of friendly competition to the evening's festivities. Several minor gods and prominent mortals eagerly volunteered to try their luck, climbing into the chest amid much joking and commentary from the watching crowd. None of these initial participants fit properly within the container's carefully calculated dimensions, some being too tall, others too broad, and still others too short to match the precise measurements that Set had specified during its construction. Each failed attempt was greeted with good-natured laughter and playful suggestions about what the poor fit might reveal about the person's character or divine status. When Osiris's turn came, Set issued the invitation with apparent casualness, suggesting that surely the king himself should have the honor of testing whether this symbol of royal authority was truly meant for him. The crowd enthusiastically supported this suggestion, calling for their beloved ruler to see whether the magnificent chest had indeed been crafted with him in mind. Osiris approached the container with the relaxed confidence of someone who had no reason to suspect treachery from his own family. He admired the craftsmanship one final time before climbing inside, stretching out comfortably within the perfectly fitted interior while the assembled guests cheered and applauded. For a moment, everything seemed exactly as it should be, a joyful celebration reaching its natural climax with the guest of honor receiving a gift that had been designed specifically for him. Then, Set's mask finally fell away, revealing the hatred and malice that had been festering in his heart for so many years. With a speed that caught everyone completely off guard, he slammed the chest's heavy lid closed and began securing it with metal bands and molten lead that his co-conspirators had prepared in advance. The sudden transformation from festive game to deadly trap happened so quickly that most of the guests stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Osiris's muffled cries from within the sealed container finally broke the spell of stunned silence that had fallen over the banquet hall. Some of the guests rushed forward to help free the trapped god king, but Set's supporters had positioned themselves strategically throughout the room and now revealed themselves by blocking these rescue attempts. The scene erupted into chaos as loyal defenders of Osiris clashed with Set's conspirators, while others fled in terror from what had become a battlefield rather than a celebration. Isis watched in horror as the chaos unfolded before her, her divine senses immediately recognizing the malevolent magic that Set had woven into his trap. The chest that had seemed like a masterpiece of artistic achievement now pulsed with dark energy, its beautiful decorations transforming into binding spells that would prevent anyone from opening it through normal means. The goddess realized with crystalline clarity that this had been no spontaneous act of jealousy, but a carefully orchestrated assassination that had been planned for months or perhaps even years. The battle raging around her seemed to move in slow motion as her mind raced through potential solutions to save her beloved husband. Every second that passed brought Osiris closer to suffocation within his ornate prison, while the metal bands that Set's accomplices were welding into place would make rescue increasingly impossible. She could hear his voice growing weaker as he called her name, the sound barely audible above the clash of weapons and shouts of combatants. Drawing upon reserves of magical power that she had never needed to access before, Isis began weaving spells of protection and binding that might slow Set's murderous work while she formulated a plan of rescue. Her fingers traced patterns in the air that left trails of golden light, hieroglyphs of power that hung suspended like burning stars above the chaotic scene. Each symbol she created carried the weight of cosmic law, invoking ancient forces that predated even the gods themselves. But Set had prepared for this possibility as well, surrounding himself with protective wards that deflected her magical attacks and continuing his grim work with methodical determination. His own power, drawn from the chaotic forces of storm and desert, proved frustratingly effective against her spells of order and healing. The fundamental opposition between their natures, which had once seemed like complementary aspects of cosmic balance, now became a barrier that prevented her from saving the one person who mattered most to her. The loyal defenders of Osiris fought valiantly against Set's conspirators, but they had been caught completely unprepared for treachery during what should have been a peaceful celebration. Many of the gods who might have turned the tide of battle were absent from the banquet, attending to their own responsibilities throughout the kingdom, while others had been deliberately excluded from Set's guest list to prevent exactly this kind of intervention. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Isis realized that direct confrontation would not save Osiris in time. She would need to employ different tactics, using her knowledge of divine law and cosmic justice to create leverage that even Set would be forced to respect. The goddess began invoking the ancient protocols that governed disputes between divine beings, calling upon the Supreme Council of Gods to intervene in what was clearly a violation of the fundamental laws that maintained order throughout the universe. Her voice rose above the sounds of battle, carrying with it the authority of one who understood the deepest mysteries of creation itself. The words she spoke were in the old tongue, the language that had been used to speak the world into existence, and their power resonated through multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Every god in Egypt would hear her summons and be compelled to respond, regardless of their current location or activities. Set realized that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The arrival of other major deities would almost certainly result in his defeat and punishment, while Isis's legal challenge might force him to release Osiris before his assassination could be completed. In desperation, he made a decision that would transform his act of brotherly jealousy into something far more catastrophic and irreversible. Working with supernatural speed, Set's supporters lifted the sealed chest and carried it toward the Nile, intending to cast it into the sacred waters where the current would carry it far from any possibility of rescue. The river that had brought life and prosperity to Egypt would become the instrument of their beloved king's destruction, its holy waters transformed into an accomplice to divine murder. Isis pursued them with the fury of a lioness protecting her cubs, her magical attacks growing more desperate and powerful as she realized what they intended to do. She summoned winds that howled with the voices of the dead, calling upon every spirit that had ever benefited from Osiris's just rule to rise up and prevent this atrocity. The very air around the fleeing conspirators began to thicken and resist their movement, while the ground beneath their feet became treacherous and unstable. Yet Set's determination proved stronger than her magical interference, fueled by years of accumulated resentment and the intoxicating rush of finally acting upon his darkest impulses. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, committing himself to a path that would either result in his ultimate triumph or his complete destruction. The knowledge that he had burned all bridges behind him only intensified his focus on completing the task he had begun. The group reached the riverbank just as the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky with shades of gold and crimson. The timing seemed almost prophetic, as if the sun itself were bearing witness to this moment of cosmic transition. Set paused for one final moment, looking back at his sister-in-law, who stood frozen with horror at the water's edge, her magical powers temporarily exhausted by her desperate attempts to prevent this tragedy. With a gesture that combined triumph and finality, Set commanded his followers to cast the chest into the Nile's swift current. The ornate container struck the water with a splash that seemed to echo across the entire kingdom, sending ripples that would eventually reach every corner of the civilized world. The sacred river, which had always been Egypt's source of life and renewal, now carried within its depths the instrument of divine death. Isis watched helplessly as the chest disappeared beneath the dark waters, carried away by currents that would bear it far beyond the reach of immediate rescue efforts. Her anguished cry split the morning air, a sound so filled with grief and rage that it caused birds to fall silent and flowers to wither along the riverbank. The goddess who had brought healing and hope to countless mortals now found herself powerless to save the one person whose life gave meaning to her own existence. Set stood triumphant on the riverbank for a moment, savoring his victory over the brother who had always overshadowed him and the sister-in-law whose magical abilities had made her seem invincible. The crown of Egypt was within his grasp, along with the authority to reshape the kingdom according to his own vision of proper divine rule. Yet even in his moment of triumph, he could not entirely escape the knowledge that he had committed an act that would brand him as a kinslayer and oath-breaker throughout eternity. The news of Osiris's assassination spread across Egypt with supernatural speed, carried by winds that whispered the terrible truth to every corner of the kingdom. Temples fell silent as priests struggled to comprehend how their divine protector could have been destroyed by his own brother. Markets closed as merchants wept openly in the streets, while farmers abandoned their fields to gather in groups and share their grief with neighbors who understood their sense of loss and abandonment. The very foundations of Egyptian civilization seemed to tremble as word spread that the god-king who had brought them prosperity and justice was gone, possibly forever. The legal systems that Osiris had established continued to function, but without his guiding presence, judges found themselves uncertain about how to apply his principles to complex cases. The agricultural innovations he had taught began to seem less effective as the divine blessing that had made them work was withdrawn from the world. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, chaos threatened to engulf the kingdom that had known only peace and order under Osiris's rule. Local governors who had ruled fairly under divine oversight began to assert more independent authority, while some succumbed to the temptation to enrich themselves at their subjects' expense. Trade relationships that had been built on trust and mutual benefit started to deteriorate as partners wondered whether Egyptian promises could still be relied upon. Set moved quickly to consolidate his power, claiming that his brother's death had been a tragic accident during what was meant to be harmless entertainment. He presented himself as the natural successor to the throne, arguing that his experience and strength made him the obvious choice to lead Egypt through this difficult period of transition. Some believed his version of events, particularly those who had been part of his conspiracy or who stood to benefit from the changes he promised to implement. Yet many Egyptians, both mortal and divine, refused to accept Set's explanation or his claim to legitimate authority. They remembered too clearly the love and wisdom that Osiris had brought to his rule, contrasting it sharply with Set's reputation for violence and unpredictability. These loyal subjects began to organize resistance movements, hoping to preserve the principles of just governance until their rightful king could somehow be restored to life and power. Isis found herself at the center of this growing rebellion against Set's usurped authority. Her grief over Osiris's death was matched by her determination to see justice done and her husband's legacy preserved. She understood that simply mourning would accomplish nothing, while accepting Set's rule would betray everything that she and Osiris had worked to build together. The goddess began her own investigation into the exact circumstances of the assassination, using her magical abilities to trace the path the chest had taken as it was carried downstream by the Nile's current. She discovered that the container had traveled much farther than anyone had initially realized, passing beyond Egypt's borders and eventually washing ashore in the distant land of Byblos, where it had become entangled in the roots of a great tamarisk tree. The tree had grown with supernatural speed around the chest, its trunk expanding to completely enclose the container within its heartwood. Local inhabitants of Byblos had been amazed by the tree's rapid growth and the sweet fragrance that emanated from its bark and leaves. The king of that distant land had ordered the tree cut down and its trunk carved into a pillar that now supported the roof of his palace, unknowingly making himself the guardian of Osiris's tomb. This discovery filled Isis with renewed hope, for if the chest still existed, there might be ways to recover her husband's body and attempt the magical resurrection that could restore him to life. The process would be complex and dangerous, requiring her to master forms of magic that had never been attempted before, but the alternative was accepting defeat and allowing Set's evil to triumph permanently. The goddess began her preparations for the journey to Byblos, knowing that she would need to travel in disguise to avoid detection by Set's spies and agents. She could not afford to let her brother-in-law learn about the chest's location, for he would certainly send forces to destroy it completely if he discovered that Osiris's body still existed. The mission would require not only magical skill, but also cunning, patience, and the ability to gain the trust of foreign rulers who had no reason to help an Egyptian goddess. Before departing on this crucial quest, Isis took steps to ensure that the resistance against Set's rule would continue during her absence. She established secret networks of communication that would allow loyal Egyptians to coordinate their efforts while avoiding detection by the usurper's security forces. Trusted priests and priestesses were given coded messages that would rally the faithful when the time came for open rebellion. The goddess also began teaching selected followers the advanced magical techniques they would need to protect themselves and their communities during the dark times that lay ahead. These lessons were conducted in hidden sanctuaries far from Set's centers of power, often in desert caves or remote oases where loyal Egyptians could gather without attracting unwanted attention. Her students learned to create protective wards that would shield their homes and families from the malevolent influences that Set was beginning to unleash upon the kingdom. They mastered techniques for healing injuries and illnesses that the usurper's agents might inflict, while also acquiring the ability to communicate across vast distances through magical means that could not be intercepted or decoded by hostile forces. Perhaps most importantly, Isis taught her followers how to preserve and protect the true stories of Osiris's reign, ensuring that future generations would remember the justice and prosperity that divine rule could bring to Egypt. These sacred narratives were encoded in songs, artwork, and religious ceremonies that appeared innocent to casual observers, but contained detailed information about the legitimate government that Set had destroyed. The goddess understood that her mission to Byblos might take months or even years to complete, during which time Set would have opportunities to consolidate his power and eliminate his opponents. She needed to create a foundation of resistance that could survive and grow even without her direct leadership, preparing the ground for the eventual restoration that she prayed would be possible. As she made her final preparations for departure, Isis spent long hours in meditation and prayer, seeking guidance from the cosmic forces that governed life, death, and rebirth. She knew that she was about to embark upon a journey that would test every aspect of her divine nature, challenging her wisdom, courage, and magical abilities in ways that could not be fully anticipated. The path ahead led through foreign lands filled with unknown dangers, requiring her to navigate complex political situations while maintaining her disguise and avoiding the attention of Set's agents. Even if she succeeded in recovering Osiris's body, the magic required to restore him to life would push her abilities to their absolute limits and might demand sacrifices that she could barely imagine. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. Without Osiris's return, Egypt would remain under the dominion of chaos and violence, while the principles of justice and compassion that had made their civilization a beacon to the world would gradually fade into mere memory. The love she bore for her husband demanded that she attempt his resurrection, regardless of the personal cost or the probability of success. On the night before her departure, Isis performed one final ritual at the temple where she and Osiris had been married in happier times. She offered prayers to every god and goddess who had ever shown favor to their union, asking for their blessing on the desperate mission she was about to undertake. The ceremony lasted until dawn, filling her with spiritual strength that would sustain her through the trials ahead. As the sun rose over Egypt for the first time since Osiris's death, Isis transformed herself into the appearance of a humble mortal woman, concealing her divine nature beneath the guise of a traveling healer who sought to learn foreign medical techniques. This disguise would allow her to move freely through the kingdoms that lay between Egypt and Byblos, while her reputation as a healer would provide natural explanations for any unusual abilities she might need to display. The goddess set out on foot, carrying only basic supplies and a few simple tools that would support her assumed identity. Her heart was heavy with grief and uncertainty, but her spirit burned with determination to succeed in her mission or die in the attempt. Behind her lay a kingdom in chaos, while ahead stretched a path filled with unknown dangers and the faint hope of resurrection. The morning mist that rose from the Nile seemed to carry whispers of encouragement from the spirits of those who had benefited from Osiris's just rule. Birds called out from the reeds, as if bidding her farewell and promising to carry news of her progress to the loyal subjects who awaited her return. The very air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the entire world held its breath, waiting to see whether love and determination could triumph over death and treachery. Akari. The journey to Byblos stretched before Isis like an endless ribbon of uncertainty, winding through territories where Egyptian influence had never taken root, and where her divine nature would mean nothing to those who had never heard Osiris's name spoken with reverence. The goddess walked steadily northward, her mortal disguise holding firm despite the magical energies that coursed beneath her assumed human form like hidden rivers of starlight. The first kingdom she encountered beyond Egypt's borders was a land of rolling hills covered in olive groves, where the people spoke in musical dialects that reminded her of wind chimes dancing in gentle breezes. Here she practiced her role as a traveling healer, offering remedies for common ailments while carefully gathering information about the routes that led toward the distant coast where Byblos lay waiting. The local inhabitants proved surprisingly welcoming to the humble woman who claimed to possess knowledge of Egyptian medical arts. They had heard stories of the miraculous healing techniques developed along the Nile, though these tales had grown distorted through countless retellings until they bore only passing resemblance to the actual practices Isis had established during her reign. She found herself in the peculiar position of learning about her own innovations through the lens of foreign interpretation. In the village squares, where merchants gathered to trade goods and gossip, Isis listened carefully to conversations that might reveal useful intelligence about conditions in the coastal regions. She learned that Byblos had indeed experienced something unusual in recent months, with reports of a magnificent tree that had grown with supernatural speed and emitted the most wonderful fragrance anyone had ever encountered. The tree had become the talk of the entire region, drawing visitors from neighboring kingdoms who came simply to witness this botanical marvel. These reports filled the goddess with cautious optimism, confirming that her magical tracking had led her in the correct direction. Yet she also detected undertones of political tension in the merchants' discussions, suggestions that the rapid changes occurring throughout the region had created instability that ambitious rulers were eager to exploit. The assassination of Egypt's god-king had sent ripples far beyond the Nile Valley, disrupting established trade relationships and creating opportunities for those willing to take advantage of the chaos. Some merchants spoke fearfully of strange phenomena that had begun manifesting in the wake of Osiris's death. Crops were failing in regions that had previously been models of agricultural success, while normally gentle animals had become aggressive and unpredictable. The very weather patterns seemed to have shifted, bringing unseasonable storms to areas that had enjoyed stable climates for generations. These disturbances were clearly connected to the cosmic imbalance created by Set's act of divine murder. Isis realized that her mission carried implications far beyond her personal desire to resurrect her beloved husband. The stability of the entire region depended upon restoring the natural order that Osiris's death had disrupted. His assassination had torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself, allowing chaotic forces to seep through and contaminate the ordered world that divine rule had created and maintained. As she traveled deeper into foreign territory, the goddess encountered increasing evidence of Set's expanding influence. Bandits had become bolder and more organized, suggesting that they were receiving support from sources beyond mere criminal opportunism. Caravans reported attacks by creatures that should not have existed in these temperate lands, desert predators whose presence so far from their natural habitat indicated supernatural transportation. Local rulers were struggling to maintain order as their traditional methods of governance proved inadequate against threats that defied natural explanation. Some had begun adopting harsher measures, imposing strict curfews and authorizing violent punishments for minor offenses in desperate attempts to maintain control. Others had retreated into fortified strongholds, abandoning their subjects to face the growing chaos without leadership or protection. The breakdown of established authority created perfect conditions for Set's agents to operate freely, spreading discord and fear while recruiting followers from among those who had lost faith in conventional forms of government. The usurper was methodically extending his influence beyond Egypt's borders, building a network of allies and vassals who would support his claim to legitimate authority throughout the region. Isis understood that every day she spent traveling toward Byblos allowed Set to strengthen his position and make her eventual return more difficult. Yet she also recognized that rushing her mission would likely result in failure, leaving Osiris permanently dead, while she herself fell victim to the traps that undoubtedly awaited any attempt at premature action. The delicate balance between speed and caution required constant adjustment as circumstances changed around her. The goddess began incorporating subtle, magical interventions into her journey, using her powers to assist the communities she encountered while avoiding actions that might reveal her true identity. A village suffering from a mysterious plague found their wells suddenly running clear again after the traveling healer had examined their water sources. Crops that had been withering under unseasonable heat began to recover when she passed through agricultural areas and offered advice about irrigation techniques. These small acts of divine intervention served multiple purposes beyond simple compassion. They helped establish her reputation as an exceptionally skilled healer, providing cover for any unusual abilities she might need to display later. They also created networks of gratitude and goodwill that could prove valuable if she needed assistance during her return journey. Most importantly, they began the process of healing the damage that Set's chaotic influence was inflicting upon the innocent populations caught in the struggle between order and disorder. Yet Isis was careful to limit her interventions to effects that could be attributed to advanced medical knowledge rather than obvious supernatural power. She could not afford to attract the attention of Set's spies, who would certainly be watching for any signs of divine activity that might indicate her location and intentions. The goddess walked a tightrope between helping those in need and maintaining the secrecy upon which her mission's success depended. The journey took on a rhythm of days spent walking through increasingly unfamiliar landscapes, evenings passed in village inns, listening to local conversations, and nights devoted to magical meditation that helped her maintain connection with the cosmic forces that guided her path. She learned to appreciate the subtle differences between regional cultures, finding beauty in the diversity of human expression while recognizing the underlying similarities that connected all civilized peoples. The languages changed as she moved farther from Egypt, requiring her to master new dialects and customs that would allow her to blend seamlessly into each community she encountered. Her divine nature provided advantages in this learning process, allowing hers to absorb linguistic patterns with supernatural speed while understanding the cultural contexts that gave meaning to different forms of expression. In a mountain kingdom where the people carved their homes directly into cliffsides, she learned songs that celebrated the eternal strength of stone and the patience required to shape it according to human needs. The inhabitants of this vertical civilization had developed architectural techniques that seemed to defy gravity, creating structures that hung suspended over vast chasms while providing comfortable living spaces for entire families. Their rulers governed through councils of master craftsmen who made decisions based on practical considerations rather than abstract political theories. This system had created a remarkably stable society where disputes were resolved through demonstrations of skill rather than violence, and where innovation was rewarded with genuine respect rather than mere wealth. The goddess found their approach refreshing after witnessing the chaos that ambitious individuals had brought to other regions. The mountain people spoke reverently of balance, understanding instinctively that their precarious homes required careful attention to the forces that could either support or destroy their communities. They had developed philosophical traditions that emphasized harmony between human needs and natural limitations, creating wisdom traditions that reminded Isis of the principles she and Osiris had tried to establish in Egypt. Yet even this stable society showed signs of strain as chaotic influences spread throughout the region. Young craftsmen were beginning to question traditional methods, not from healthy curiosity, but from restless dissatisfaction that had no clear source. Political discussions that had once focused on practical problems were becoming increasingly abstract and contentious, as if some invisible force were injecting discord into previously harmonious relationships. Isis recognized these symptoms as evidence of Set's growing power, his ability to corrupt ordered systems through subtle influences that gradually undermined the foundations of civilized behavior. The realization filled her with increased urgency, understanding that every community she encountered was slowly succumbing to the same forces that had already devastated Egypt. Her mission was not simply about resurrecting her husband, but about preventing the complete collapse of everything they had worked together to build. The coastal regions presented different challenges as the goddess approached her destination. Here, the people were accustomed to foreign visitors, making her presence less remarkable, but also requiring more sophisticated deceptions to maintain her assumed identity. The ports were filled with merchants from across the known world, their conversations creating a babel of languages and customs that could overwhelm even divine senses. The economic prosperity of these trading centers had created complex social hierarchies where wealth and political influence were constantly shifting based on the success of commercial ventures. This instability made the coastal cities fertile ground for the kind of manipulation that Set's agents specialized in, offering loans and partnerships that gradually gave them control over local decision-making processes. Isis observed how foreign gold was being used to corrupt officials who had previously been models of integrity, while mysterious benefactors were funding construction projects that served no apparent purpose beyond creating opportunities for graft and influence peddling. The pattern was so systematic that it could only represent a coordinated campaign of subversion directed from a central source. The goddess realized that Set was not simply trying to maintain control over Egypt, but was actively working to extend his dominion throughout the entire known world. His ultimate goal appeared to be the replacement of all ordered governments with chaos-based systems that would serve his personal ambitions while eliminating the possibility of organized resistance to his rule. This recognition transformed her understanding of the stakes involved in her mission. Success would not only restore Osiris to life and return legitimate government to Egypt, but would also prevent the collapse of civilization throughout the entire region. Failure, on the other hand, would leave Set free to complete his conquest of the ordered world, ushering in an age of darkness that might last for thousands of years. The weight of this responsibility threatened to overwhelm even her divine strength, yet it also provided additional motivation to succeed regardless of the personal cost. She was no longer simply a wife trying to save her husband, but a guardian of civilization itself, fighting against forces that threatened everything humanity had achieved since emerging from primitive barbarism. As the walls of Byblos finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the coastal plains like a promise of hope fulfilled, Isis felt a complex mixture of relief, anticipation, and apprehension wash over her. The city represented the culmination of her long journey, the place where she would either find the means to restore Osiris or discover that her desperate quest had been in vain from the beginning. The sight of ships in the harbor reminded her that Byblos was a major center of international trade, attracting visitors from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. This cosmopolitan atmosphere would provide excellent cover for her activities while also creating additional complications as she attempted to gain access to the royal palace, where the sacred tree had been incorporated into the building's structure. The goddess paused at the city gates to study the guards and observe the procedures they used to screen incoming travelers. She noted the questions they asked, the documents they required, and the subtle signs they looked for that might indicate hostile intentions or hidden identities. Her divine senses detected layers of magical protection woven into the city's defenses suggesting that the rulers of Byblos possessed their own supernatural advisors who had warned them about the growing chaos in the region. The complexity of the security arrangements indicated that gaining access to the royal palace would require more than simple deception or magical concealment. She would need to establish a legitimate reason for being granted audience with the king, while also creating opportunities to examine the pillar that contained Osiris's remains without arousing suspicion about her true purposes. The solution came to her as she observed the stream of petitioners seeking royal attention for various personal and commercial matters. Among them were healers offering their services to the royal household, craftsmen displaying examples of their work in hopes of receiving commissions, and scholars presenting research that might interest the educated monarch. Her assumed identity as a traveling healer would provide natural entry into this community of professionals competing for royal patronage. Isis spent several days in the city's markets and taverns, carefully studying the local customs and gathering intelligence about the royal family's interests and concerns. She learned that the king's youngest daughter had been suffering from a mysterious illness that had resisted all conventional treatments, while the queen had been experiencing prophetic dreams that troubled her sleep and left her exhausted during the day. These problems presented perfect opportunities for a skilled healer to demonstrate valuable abilities while gaining the trust and gratitude that would provide access to the palace's inner chambers. The goddess began formulating a careful plan that would allow her to approach the royal family with genuine solutions to their difficulties, establishing her credibility while creating circumstances that would naturally lead to her examination of the miraculous pillar. Yet she also recognized that success would require more than medical expertise and careful planning. The palace undoubtedly contained its own magical defenses and supernatural guardians who would detect any attempt to remove or damage the pillar without proper authorization. She would need to find ways to work around these protections while avoiding actions that might alert Set's agents to her location and activities. The complexity of the challenges ahead was daunting, yet Isis felt a growing sense of anticipation as she prepared to begin the final phase of her mission. After months of travel and preparation, she was finally approaching the moment when she would discover whether love and determination could truly triumph over death and betrayal. The sacred tree that contained her husband's remains stood somewhere within the royal palace, waiting for her arrival like a beacon of hope in a world increasingly dominated by darkness and despair. The goddess offered silent prayers to every divine force that had ever shown favor to her union with Osiris, asking for strength, wisdom, and the magical power necessary to complete the resurrection that represented the only hope for restoring balance to their chaotic world. Tomorrow she would present herself at the palace gates as a humble healer seeking to serve the royal family, beginning a deception that would either lead to the greatest triumph in the history of divine magic or to her own destruction at the hands of forces beyond even her considerable abilities to overcome. The morning air carried the scent of cedar and sea salt as Isis approached the gleaming gates of Byblos, her heart beating with the measured rhythm of one who understands that destiny awaits just beyond the next threshold. The guards who stood watch wore robes of deep blue silk that caught the early light, like captured fragments of ocean waves, their bronze spears reflecting the sun's rays in patterns that seemed almost ceremonial in their precision. She had spent the previous evening in careful preparation, weaving subtle enchantments into her appearance that would make her seem more trustworthy and competent without revealing any trace of her divine nature. Her clothing now bore the faint aroma of healing herbs that would support her assumed identity, while her hands carried the slight discoloration that came from years of working with medicinal compounds and surgical instruments. The lead guard, a weathered man whose scars spoke of battles fought in distant lands, examined her travel documents with the thoroughness of one who had learned to detect deception through hard experience. His questions were routine yet probing, designed to reveal inconsistencies in her story without seeming overtly suspicious. Isis answered each inquiry with the patient confidence of someone whose credentials could withstand scrutiny, providing details about her training and experience that painted a picture of dedicated expertise earned through years of study and practice. Her responses satisfied the guard's requirements, and she found herself granted entry into a city that buzzed with commercial energy and international sophistication. The streets were wider than those in most Egyptian cities, designed to accommodate the constant flow of merchant caravans and diplomatic processions that formed the backbone of Byblos's prosperity. Buildings rose in terraced levels that followed the natural contours of the coastal hills, their architecture blending influences from across the Mediterranean world into a harmonious whole that spoke of cultural confidence and artistic achievement. The marketplace where she established her temporary practice occupied a central square, surrounded by columns carved with intricate patterns that told stories of the city's founding and growth. Here, merchants from distant lands displayed goods that represented the finest achievements of their respective civilizations, while local craftsmen demonstrated techniques that had been refined through generations of accumulated expertise. Isis set up her healing station beneath a canvas awning that provided shade while allowing curious observers to witness her work with patients who sought relief from various ailments and injuries. She had brought with her a collection of medicines and instruments that would support her assumed identity, though her real healing power came from magical abilities that she would need to disguise as advanced medical knowledge. Her first patients were drawn from the ranks of merchants and travelers who had heard rumors about the Egyptian healer's exceptional skills. She treated a caravan leader whose infected wound had resisted conventional remedies, using a combination of herbal compounds and subtle magical intervention that produced rapid healing without obvious supernatural effects. Word of her success spread quickly through the marketplace, attracting additional patients who brought increasingly complex medical challenges. By the third day of her practice, Isis had established a reputation that reached beyond the merchant community into the circles of local nobility who were always interested in acquiring access to superior medical services. A succession of well-dressed servants began appearing at her station, their carefully worded inquiries revealing that prominent families were considering whether to request her services for private consultations. The breakthrough she had been hoping for came when an elderly woman approached her station with the hesitant manner of someone who had exhausted all conventional options. The woman introduced herself as Malkander, the chief nursemaid to the royal household, explaining that she had been authorized to investigate reports about the foreign healer whose techniques were producing remarkable results among the marketplace patients. Isis listened carefully as Malkander described the mysterious illness that had afflicted the king's youngest daughter, a condition that manifested as alternating periods of fever and chills accompanied by troubling dreams that left the child exhausted and frightened. The royal physicians had tried every treatment known to their medical traditions, but nothing had provided more than temporary relief from symptoms that seemed to have no identifiable cause. The goddess recognized immediately that this illness was almost certainly connected to the supernatural disturbances that were spreading throughout the region as a result of Set's growing influence. The child was probably sensitive to magical energies, making her particularly vulnerable to the chaotic forces that were seeping into the ordered world through the cosmic wound created by Osiris's assassination. She explained to Malkander that such mysterious ailments often responded to healing techniques that addressed spiritual as well as physical imbalances, suggesting that her Egyptian training had exposed her to therapeutic approaches that might prove effective where conventional medicine had failed. The nursemaid listened with growing interest, clearly impressed by the healer's sophisticated understanding of the complex relationship between mind, body, and spirit in maintaining health. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace messenger who whispered urgently in Malkander's ear, his expression suggesting that some new crisis had developed within the royal household. The nursemaid's face grew pale as she absorbed whatever information he had brought, and she turned back to Isis with an expression that combined desperation with newfound hope. The queen herself had begun experiencing prophetic visions that were so vivid and disturbing that she could no longer distinguish between dream and waking reality. These supernatural experiences were occurring with increasing frequency, leaving her mentally exhausted and emotionally shattered as she struggled to understand the cosmic warnings that were apparently being transmitted through her consciousness. Isis realized that the queen's condition was almost certainly connected to her own presence in the city and the proximity of Osiris's remains within the palace walls. The sacred tree that contained her husband's body was evidently generating spiritual energies that were affecting sensitive individuals throughout the royal household, creating the very opportunities she needed to gain access to the palace interior. She agreed to accompany Malkander to the palace immediately, gathering her medical supplies while privately preparing the magical techniques she would need to help the afflicted royal family members, while simultaneously beginning her investigation of the mysterious pillar that had been carved from the supernatural tree. The moment she had been working toward for so many months was finally at hand, though the challenges that awaited her within the palace walls would test every aspect of her divine abilities. The royal palace of Byblos rose from its hilltop setting like a testament to human ambition harmonized with natural beauty, its white limestone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, while gardens cascaded down the slopes in terraced displays of carefully cultivated splendor. Isis followed Malkander through gates that were guarded by soldiers whose weapons bore the distinctive blue-green patina of bronze that had been worked by master craftsmen and blessed by the city's patron deities. The interior courtyards revealed architecture that celebrated both functionality and aesthetic achievement, with fountains that provided cooling relief from the coastal heat, while their musical sounds created an atmosphere of tranquil sophistication. Palm trees and flowering shrubs had been arranged in patterns that pleased the eye while providing natural divisions between different areas of the complex, creating intimate spaces for private conversations within the larger framework of public grandeur. As they walked deeper into the palace, Isis became increasingly aware of the supernatural energies that permeated the entire structure, emanating from somewhere in the central section where the most important ceremonial and residential chambers were located. Her divine senses detected the familiar spiritual signature of her beloved husband, though it was muted by the wooden matrix that surrounded his physical remains and filtered through layers of protective magic that the palace's own guardians had woven around their mysterious pillar. Malkander led her through corridors decorated with frescoes that depicted the history of Byblos and its trading relationships with distant lands, showing ships laden with precious goods arriving from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the mysterious regions that lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The artistic style demonstrated sophisticated techniques that had been influenced by multiple cultural traditions while maintaining a distinctly local character that spoke of confident artistic identity. The nursemaid paused outside an ornately carved door that marked the entrance to the royal family's private quarters, explaining in hushed tones the protocol that would govern Isis's interaction with the queen and her daughter. The goddess would be expected to demonstrate appropriate deference while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as presumptuous or disrespectful. Yet she would also need to establish sufficient authority to be trusted with sensitive medical information and given access to the patients she claimed to be able to help. Queen Astarte received them in a chamber that balanced royal dignity with maternal warmth, her clothing and jewelry reflecting both her elevated status and her current emotional distress. The woman who rose to greet them possessed the refined beauty that came from generations of noble breeding, yet her eyes held shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and psychological torment that was wearing away her natural resilience. Isis observed the queen carefully as introductions were made, noting the subtle signs that revealed the true nature of her supernatural affliction. The visions she was experiencing were not random products of a disturbed imagination, but genuine prophetic glimpses of possible futures that were being transmitted through her consciousness by forces that recognized her spiritual sensitivity and sought to communicate crucial information about the cosmic crisis that threatened their world. The goddess explained her understanding of such conditions in terms that would be comprehensible to mortals who lacked direct experience with divine communication, suggesting that certain individuals possessed natural abilities that made them receptive to spiritual influences that others could not perceive. These gifts could become overwhelming when cosmic disturbances created unusually intense spiritual energies that exceeded the person's normal capacity to process supernatural information. And so, as the gentle currents of the Nile continue their eternal journey toward the sea, carrying with them the whispered prayers of those who remember the golden age of divine rule, we reach the end of our journey through the timeless tale of Isis. Her story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when chaos seems to triumph over order and death appears to have the final word, The power of love and unwavering determination can illuminate pathways that lead from despair to hope, from endings to new beginnings. Let the rhythm of her footsteps echo in your dreams tonight, guiding you toward peaceful rest beneath the same stars that once watched over the gods of ancient Egypt.